Hi, everybody. Welcome to Leading Your Collection Through STEM OER. I'm Marcia Martis, and I'm happy to be with you for the next 45 minutes to talk about science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and open educational resources, as well as how to lead with your collection. So I am going to just advance us along here, ALIA members. So glad to be with you today. A little bit of an agenda for us. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit because we probably haven't had the opportunity to meet, and talk a little bit about this flipped webinar that we're engaging in. Then I'm just going to say actually probably maybe 5-10 minutes about STEM, and then I want to spend the rest of the time talking about open educational resources and curation, then wrap up with some final thoughts. So about this flipped webinar professional development format. So you can take in professional learning in a number of different ways, but one of the advantages of the flipped professional development format is that it's very flexible. You can review the recording as a group or individually. You can start it, you can stop it, you can use it in many different ways. You can divide it up into shorter segments because you have an archived copy that you can return to for reinforcement. Professional learning, when it's delivered through any kind of technology, but particularly video, tends to really be highly effective, precisely for those reasons that you can use the video in so many different ways. And it allows you also to engage with professionals in a tailored, affordable way. So I'm able to tailor this content for you in a way that makes it easy for us to communicate from Tallahassee to Melbourne. So I wanted to talk first a little bit about me. I'm a professor at the School of Information at Florida State University, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Research, which, has its ups and downs, I'll be honest. It's very interesting, though, to think about research and leadership together. And so that's one of the themes that I think will cut through everything that we talk about today. So when we talk about research and administration together, that is very much like what the school librarian or teacher librarian does every day. So if we think about how I got started doing the work that we're going to talk about today, I have been called the OG of the OE, so definitely one of the original teacher librarians who was working in the digital resource space starting in 1999. You can see me here presenting a poster, much younger version of me. So just to give you a little overview of some of those projects. So in 1999, I was part of the founding group of people who created Michigan Teacher Network, which is a digital library for teachers in the state of Michigan. And we had that digital library. It was very widely used, and it was staffed by teacher librarians who in the state of Michigan have to not only have their teaching credentials in a particular subject area, but also have to have master's degrees in library and information studies. So they did all of our collection development, and all of the resources in there were described for educational application. And so when I became a professor in 2005, I had the project moved to the State of Michigan Library, and they renamed it MORE, Michigan Online Resources for Educators. And I'm proud to say that the digital library lived on and was actually just sunset last year. But that same combination of teacher librarians selecting the resources and describing them for educational application was true all the way till the end of the project. That project was also a member of the National Science Digital Library, which provided science, technology, engineering, and mathematics learning resources at the K-12 level for learners throughout the United States. And the National Science Digital Library actually also sunset a few years ago, and now all of its content belongs to OER Commons, which is a group that we're going to talk quite a bit about today. I was inspired through these projects to create a little tool called Web to Mark, which we're not going to look at today, but we may want to talk about returning to another time. Web to Mark allows teacher librarians in particular, that's who it's designed for, to create MARC records for open educational resources that they find on the web. So if you have a moment to search digital libraries to school libraries or Web to Mark, you can find the tool out there and use it today. I also have gotten the opportunity to work with a much larger project called iDigBio. And what iDigBio is about is digitizing biological specimens. So if you think about biological specimens, maybe as something you might find at O'Reilly's Lodge, up in the mountains in Queensland or something like that, things that are in jars, pinned to pieces of cardboard, all sorts of different ways that botanists and biologists collected biological resources in ways that didn't age particularly well. So iDigBio is about beating the clock and digitizing these specimens so that to preserve them. And I work on the aspect of educational implementation for all of these specimens. So if you go to idigbio.org, you can get a sample of the kind of work that we've done and the kinds of educational implementations that we've dreamed up. But I think it's something that's a really interesting offering to teacher librarians, particularly in the age of makerspaces. And all of that work went alongside Internet 2, which is ultra high speed bandwidth that enables things like remote instrumentation, simultaneous piano playing between continents. And so that ultra high speed bandwidth really is enabling the sort of real-time activity that we envision with Internet connectivity. And of course, as I mentioned, some work with OER Commons, who are now the stewards of the National Science Digital Library collection, but also have a pretty vast collection of their own. OERcommons.org if you want to take a look while we're talking. I also have worked with Florida State University libraries in helping faculty on campus change their textbook resources, which can be very costly for college students, into open educational resources. And no surprise, the people who started it first were the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics professors. So you can see there's a little bit of a theme happening here. And finally, I've also returned to consult to the Go Open Michigan because the state of Michigan has made a pledge to decrease textbook costs by using open educational resources. Some are authored, some are collected, but with an effort of making high quality resources available at no cost. So let's talk a little bit about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The National Science Foundation, in partnership with the American Institutes for Research, released a report in which they detail what they call the STEM 2026 vision. And so as I read through the report and saw this graphic that was in the report, I thought, wow, this just really seems like what teacher librarians do every day. We think about innovative ways to measure learning all of the time, not just tests, but other kinds of performances that demonstrate what learners know. We think about flexible learning spaces. In fact, we've been facilitating flexible learning spaces right from the very beginning. And we've often talked about, for years and years, solving grand challenges through authentic learning in real world problems. And having students understand that they can take risks in the school libraries with their learning and their experimentation, and they're pursuing ideas that are unique to them. These also lead to engaging in a network of practice and understanding that what you do in your school affects people around you and outside of your school. That's a value near and dear to teacher librarians. And of course, promoting diversity, which is something we do through our collection, as well as the activities that are instigated and facilitated by that collection. The National Science Foundation and AIR also really felt that we need to be looking at science, technology, and engineering and mathematics a bit differently because math scores and traditional math tests are struggling, particularly for minority and high poverty students. And that what we end up seeing is when we think of STEM in a very traditional classroom sense, that learning tends to only be available to honor students and advanced students because the classrooms are small, the equipment is expensive. So there's a need to be thinking about the cost of the materials to learn STEM. And that STEM is very stovepiped in that what you're learning in biology class or in Algebra 2 class is not being connected to what you're doing in any other kinds of classes. And so I think probably if you think about your school, that's more often than not the case. So the question becomes then, how do we integrate STEM? Well, let's think about our collection, because that's usually the entry point to any kind of solution that teacher librarians consider. So the average book cost is about $14 US, and image-rich books are even more expensive. And so if we think about an average secondary level collection of being around 13,000 volumes, and that may sound a little high to you, but that's pretty much the average in the US, and that's, I don't know about you, but that sounds to me like an unweeded collection. And the average library budget being around $9,000, that's a pretty big undertaking for any school. That's a lot of space, that's a lot of cost. And as technology is increasing, teacher librarians' budgets are also decreasing. So the question becomes how to leverage that offset through the technology that's increasingly part of your reality. And let's face it, when it comes to STEM materials, the commercial stuff is really not that great. There's a lot more exciting applications that technology allows us to have in STEM learning that are just very difficult to realize in a print format. And that the databases that you subscribe to and that are available to you from the government, such as Trove, for example, really end up being worth about $150,000 a person in a person's learning lifetime. So what we need to realize is that high quality free stuff is in abundance, but we have to find it, we have to organize it, and we have to describe it. And we have to promote it to our learners. So in terms of STEM collection development, we already talked about computers and technology increasing and budget decreasing, and that commercial stuff is not that great. But we also know that most of our STEM collections really need to be weeded. What we have is a situation where in Dewey ranges 500 and 600, that is science, mathematics, and technology. What we have is really an average book age of 17 years, and that's pretty alarming, because the rule of thumb for weeding is anything older than 7 years in those two areas is probably worth tossing out. And that when you look even deeply into the Dewey, such as into 570s and 610s, that really 1 to 3 years is about the max lifespan, because technology and science are moving so quickly that these are areas that are very sensitive to rapid change. And when you think about how long it takes for a book to go from conception to authoring to editing to publication, that's about 3 years. So really print is out of step with STEM and the rate of change in science and technology. And as we mentioned, science books are expensive, image-rich books are the best ones, and they're unfortunately the most expensive ones. I found a study that I really thought might be the good thing to give to you now as our transition. So we've talked about STEM collections and different ways that we're starting to think about STEM as more collaborative, flexible kind of learning. And this study, which I found at the link that you'll see there, Karen Malvin did in Australia, and it's provided through Charles Stir. A quote that she has in her study that I was very struck by is, OER is an emerging global phenomenon in K-12 education and of interest to connected teacher librarians like all of you, that's what you're doing right now, who are writing blogs, conducting webinars, and writing articles to encourage other teacher librarians to embrace OER and become leaders within their schools. So if you're not doing that already, now you get to be part of the movement. OER provides opportunities for teacher librarians all over the world to redefine their role and be the OER experts in their school. Now, Karen's study was on Australian teacher librarians, and what she found is that of the librarians who were aware of open educational resources in general, their feelings were very positive, but they also felt a little bit overwhelmed at how to get started and really how to keep the movement going. And so the entry point, I'm arguing, is STEM, because we know that that is the most sensitive part of your collection, and that's the place where you're probably investing the most money. And you can see I pulled out the table out of Karen's study here, talking about just summarizing the teacher librarian's feelings toward OER. So let's first talk about the notion of open. So a colleague of mine, David Wiley from Lumen Learning, explained the concept of open when it comes to learning resources like this. We learn by the things we do. Okay, I think we can all agree upon that. And copyright, such as things that are in print books, for example, restricts what we're permitted to do. So you can enjoy the book, but you can't photocopy the book, or you can't make a copy of the book to give to somebody else. Chances are it's very expensive, so you're probably not chopping it up. So consequently, copyright restricts the way we're permitted to learn. So think about that. I never really looked at it that way. And then once things are openly licensed, it removes these restrictions and permits us to do new things. We can copy, we can remix, we can edit, we can share. And so consequently, open permits us to learn in new ways. So remember though, the first caveat I have is that open is free to you, and open educational resource is free to you, but it's not free to the person who produces it. So let's talk about what that means. So one of the things that we all think about is the public domain. Certainly if it's out on the web, it's freely available to use, right? Well, yes and no. Things in the public domain are available to the public, but they're not necessarily available for you to do with whatever you want. There's different categories of things that are available to the public. And so you don't know if it's legal until you investigate the licensing a little bit. And so I pulled from Creative Commons Australia this Creative Commons traffic light, which I think is a really good summary of Creative Commons licensing. And so you can see it goes from the most restrictive, which is things that are copyrighted at the very top with red, to things that may have some restrictions on them, or what they call copy left. And those things require you to always give attribution, of course, but restrict in many different ways, whether you can create a derivative work, whether you can edit and remix, and whether you may be able to benefit financially from the things that you create. But then you go down into the green areas of Creative Commons licensing, and you see that all the way down from openly available, do with whatever you want, things that are truly fully in the public domain, to things that just require attribution, and if you share it, make sure the attribution follows along with it. And so the green stamp there, as you'll see on the right, that's really where we want to leverage open educational resources. So something else I pulled from Creative Commons Australia was a really nice flowchart in determining, when you create a resource, the kinds of Creative Commons licensing that you need. And so I just thought this was a really helpful way of helping you determine whether you want something to be copyrighted, or if there isn't a level of Creative Commons that may work for your resource. So open is free. Not free to the producer, but we don't always know if free is high quality. Sometimes you do get what you pay for. For example, one of the areas of openly available material is an open access journal, and something that I think we want our secondary students to be particularly familiar with, because we want them to be using more scholarly sources of information. However, because the resources are free to you, but they're not free to the producer, in many situations, these journals actually charge the people who are creating the articles to publish the articles. They don't charge people to access the articles, though. And so I read this as the Associate Dean of Research. I read a blog called Retraction Watch. And if you're sort of a person who's into science and scientific publishing, you might want to check this blog out too. I found this very funny article there. One of the things that Retraction Watch reports are when people violate norms of science, human subjects, scientific research sort of ethics, but also they follow problems that are happening in scientific publishing, such as papers that are junk science. And so it seems to make a point that one journal prankster got into publication a paper that actually had a Star Wars theme. So the author was George Lucas, and the data was documenting mid-chlorians. And so if you're a Star Wars person, you know that that's a character from the Star Wars films. And it actually made it into publication in 3 journals. And the only reason why it didn't in the 4th is because the author wouldn't come up with the money to publish the paper. So the article was free, but is this the kind of thing that you want your secondary students citing? The prank was so subtle, though, that it made it through the vetting process at 3 different journals. So something to keep in mind when we talk about open is that free may not be high quality. Even in something that's not a prankster situation like that, a government website, which should have the most authoritative information, some games can be played there too. For example, the United States Department of Energy had this wonderful website called Energy Kids that did a particularly good job of explaining where energy comes from, how it works, and had some commentary on fossil fuels and climate change. However, with government leadership change in the United States, seemingly overnight, the site was scrubbed of particular kinds of information, and to the point where where no longer kids can go and find out about the environmental impact of fossil fuels. So one other thing to keep in mind is that open is digital, but digital's not the only answer. And I know it's a surprise to hear me say that, considering that I just spoke about the expense and the slow pace of traditional publishing. But there's always going to be a role for the handheld book, the physical book, because in some learning situations, digital is not the right answer. So I think we're really incumbent, it's incumbent upon us to have blended collections and understand how to appropriately blend those collections. So as you can see from these Pew studies here, and a Barnes & Noble study, that when it comes to learning resources, in some instances, especially in a textbook format, learners really do like to have some print material that really helps them take in the information and enjoy reading. Another thing to keep in mind on that same point is that we assume that all of our kids, because they are in the digital world and have never lived without the digital world, are tech savvy, and that's not always the case. So when we think about whether our kids would have fallen for the George Lucas mid-chlorians article, well, digital native does not necessarily mean savvy in these instances. Sometimes kids have problems in the information seeking process, and sometimes they have problems in the device process. So really, there's always going to be a growing number of roles for the teacher librarian to manage both the physical collection and the digital collection. I think that my colleagues, Melissa Gross and Don Latham, really put a good summary to it by saying, simply stated, students tend to believe that they have above average information literacy skills when, in fact, an objective test of their ability indicates that they are below proficient in terms of their actual skills. So open educational resources are definitely not something that are going to eliminate the role of the school librarian. They're going to make that role even more important. So keeping in mind that this generation is the open generation. They've been always aware at a time where government data has been openly available, where source code for many applications is open, where government forms and interacting with the government has been open, and that through edX and multi-online courses, that learning has been open. So it seems natural that they're going to expect open educational resources to be part of their learning landscape as well. And I think if we can all agree, though, that openness allows us to have better science, better innovation, better knowledge. So now let's talk about educational. So, been a lot of discussion about how to improve learning. Well, four main approaches seem to be bandied about. Recruit more talented people. Some people are just born teachers. Improve the qualifications of teachers entering or already in the profession. So make sure your teachers are educated very well and are, as they are in the profession longer, are better and better. Number three is improving the instructional methods. So making sure that those teachers that are either born to teach or are educated well to teach are using the most effective strategies. Okay. But the interesting one I thought you would want to know about is number four, which is creating open and shared instructional products, because that gives every learner an even playing field to be able to gain competence. So OER are shared instructional products. Also, there's high impact educational practices that these products have to be used in. Learning communities, well, certainly schools are those. Writing intensive courses, and I think we're starting to see a lot more attention on writing, maybe writing in different formats. It might be writing for blogs, might be writing for Twitter, but a lot of thinking about content generation. Collaborative assignments and projects. So it's very common now for all aspects of learning to be collaborative, peer coached. Research and creative activities. So we're looking at new and exciting ways for kids to identify problems and devise strategies to investigate those problems. Diversity and global learning, making sure that kids always remember that the world is far beyond their initial classroom, and that's often done through service learning and community-based learning. Internships are something that in the United States are becoming very popular at the secondary level, but that just allows kids to experience their career aspirations or some aspect of work life while they're still in school. And capstone courses and projects, so something that's just that big finish. And I know that that's something teacher librarians are always involved in, whether it's science fair, whether it's a big performance, that's a place where the teacher librarian fits in well. But most of all, common intellectual experiences, so that when students leave school, they have experiences like the other students they may encounter, and they have immediate commonality and conversation. A lot of the ways that these activities are realized, these high impact practices are realized, are things, as I mentioned, school librarians and teacher librarians do all the time, because students are becoming not just consumers of content, but creators of content. And that's really where these shared instructional products can come in. And so debate and forensics, perhaps you coach the debate team or give them space or assist them with their research. Drama, yes. Science fair, project-based learning, probably something you do every day. We already talked about service learning and internships, but book clubs, newspaper, yearbook, these are all things that you do all the time in your library. And it's not an instructional shift. It's really something that comes natural to you, because what we're thinking about as teacher librarians is making sure that our students are operating as high as possible in Bloom's taxonomy, so that their verbs for what they're doing center on designing, constructing, and planning, rather than recognizing, listing, and describing. So we take them young and we move them up this trajectory throughout their learning. And anymore, we're talking not just about the answers on a standardized test or an end of course exam, but competence. Can our learners apply what they're getting through their learning activities? One of the ways I think about this is thinking about the effect that instructional materials, including open educational resources and library materials, because it doesn't have to just be in the classroom, it can be learning materials sort of writ large, is that we need to stay aware that the learning materials are just as influential as what it is that the teacher does. And I thought that was a pretty sobering fact, to have published. So remember, in your duty to build and maintain the school's resource base, those effects are just as important as what the teacher's doing in the classroom. One of the goals that we have with learning resources is to decrease the amount of seat time where the teacher is lecturing, the kids are taking notes, that explicit academic instruction and that learning by rote, and increasing the contextualized instruction that leads to competence. But that must be personalized. And anytime you're talking about personalizing learning, then you have to have an increased number of instructional resources in order to enable learning personalization. So the more you know about the learner, the better you're able to fine-tune what they need to learn, which means the more instructional resources you must have. So speaking of resources, let's talk a little bit about resources. So when we talk about open educational resources, this is a little bit of an older study, but I think that it still holds true because in fact, a study came out last week that overwhelmingly kids are using videos for learning, and I'm sure observationally you've seen that as well. But open educational resources in terms of images and videos are two of the most widely used by far. Video lectures and tutorials, maybe something along the lines that you would see in Khan Academy or something like that, very high, a little bit less. And then open educational resources, being homework exercises that people may find out on the web for a little bit of reinforcement. Most infrequent, slides and class presentations. So I find that very funny that people want the classroom slides, but they don't always use the classroom slides. They'd rather see a video like you're watching right now. But there are other kinds of resources that are not making it into the conversation, but are very important and widely used. The first being expertise. One of the things that we want kids to learn through internships, service learning, community learning, but even in thinking about their career aspirations, but also is understanding the role of the expert. And so Australia pioneered something called the Human Library, which actually allowed experts to go to remoter villages and towns and provide their expertise when no experts in those areas were close by. Tax expertise, legal expertise, all different kinds of expertise. It doesn't necessarily have to be the advice kind. Data sets, also very collecting and describing those so they can be findable. Primary sources, and remote instrumentation and biological specimens, like I mentioned. So these are all the kinds of resources that are increasing every day. And notice that many of them have STEM applications. So this is why the STEM collection is growing and diversifying in openly available ways, but there's a lot of need to keep track of this stuff in a systematic way, in the same way that you do with all of your print resources. So that really brings up the question of, are we collecting or are we curating? So are we just compiling all of these open educational resources and keeping them in a separate list or on a web page or in a Pearl tree or in some sort of other resource, or are we really integrating them into the collection so that we can think about curating and creating an experience with the resources? So creation is not aggregation. You hear the word curation a lot, and being able to wrap your head around what curation means as opposed to collection development, I find that one of the best corollaries is really the museum world, because that's probably where you heard the word curation first. And so when you think about museums, there's the British Museum approach, which is a very self-constructed experience. So they don't really make an effort for you to have a particular path through the museum. It's all discovery, and certainly there's a role for that. But in an educational atmosphere, we don't necessarily have the luxury to let those thousand flowers bloom. We have to guide the experience a bit, which is much more like what they do at the Smithsonian museums. So the Smithsonian museums, if you've ever been to the US, and I think the Australian National Museum does this as well, has a large collection underneath it, and it rotates exhibits through the museums that that may be assembled from different parts of the collection on a rotating basis. And so when you think about the fact that these items may appear in different exhibits at different times, that's kind of the way to think about curation. You have a set of resources, but they can be combined and recombined given the learning experience that you want to facilitate or that the instructional task calls for. So this is a scene from the African American Museum, which is a Smithsonian museum, of creating an experience with and through a group of resources. And that's the way, in my mind, to think about collection development in the age of open educational resources and blended collections. Curation is an ongoing event too. So when we talk about open educational resources and integrating them into their collection, it's not just a matter of discovery. It's not just a matter of going to a particular website and seeing what good stuff is there. There's this whole burden to organize them, put them someplace that people can find them and you can go back to them, describe them in such a way that people know what to do with them, promote them so that people know you even have them, making sure you're always adjusting that description and that organization to facilitate further discovery. And it's just a life cycle that goes on. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about collection development. So, are we collecting or are we curating? And so in terms of open educational resources, we always go back to the idea that getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. So there's so much stuff on the internet. It's free to you, but is it high quality? So you need an entry point. When you think about the fact that the number of Creative Commons licensed works in the last 10 to 12 years has absolutely exponentially grown, then you need an entry point. So Pooling Ideas, which is an associated project of Creative Commons Australia, collected a few together, keeping in mind that images are the most popular open educational resource used, of some open places to begin to look for photos. And these are Australia focused in particular. But I mentioned OER Commons, and I think OER Commons is a great entry point too, because there isn't just a collection there for you to find things. They also provide tools for you to be able to create and extend and really curate the resources you have into an educational experience, rather than just a list of links on a page. And so what we have is this kind of network of resources that we want our users to think about. The first being the ones that the teachers feel the best about. They might be created by them, and that's certainly something they can do with open educational resources. The next level being resources that are assembled and created by you and curated by you. And then we have, and that's in stark opposition to just sending somebody to search engine and having them find whatever they find. I think the intermediary step that we need between the local stuff and the free range stuff is the remembering that we also want to encourage databases of periodicals, digital libraries, and those subscriptions that we all have to fund every year. So why am I talking about digital libraries? Well, digital libraries are assembled by subject matter experts, contain materials that may not be available through a free range web search, so it can be stuff that is of high quality, but hard to find elsewhere. That's described for use, so it really does hit that part of the curation life cycle, collects user ratings and reviews, but also context. So if you have a dead link or something is in the digital library that seems to be a little bit disinformational, you can report it. And also policies to see how they collect and what they collect. And then tools like OER Commons to help you take that material and make something new and wonderful with it. Here's an example of many different kinds of digital libraries. Some of these probably look familiar to you. And each of them contains metadata, so data about the data. So a descriptive record along the lines of a MARC record, which I think is a great way to describe resources that you create, that boutique collection that you can create with open educational resources. And also record the educational applications or the intended educational application for the resource, but also paradata in many instances. So you can rate and review the resources that you and or your learners use, as well as share them. So it really does enable the whole sort of usage lifecycle. But also thinking about open educational resources and learning resources in general is the consideration of granularity. So know when you want to send learners to a whole website or just a particular resource, and think about the way that's going to influence the way you organize, describe, and promote the materials. So there's nothing more frustrating than needing, for example, a short video to review a particular concept and having to search through a whole website of videos. Direct the user to the exact resource that they need. And that's the organization burden that blended collections really present to us, but the educational opportunity they present as well. It's very important to remember to match the level to the learning task. And here's a good example, I think, from PBS Learning Media. And this is a graphic that's in my collection development textbook called The Collection Programs in Schools, Concepts and Practices, is that if you think about PBS Learning Media, which is the public broadcasting system in the United States, all of the videos created with taxpayer money, so it's considered public assets. And some of it is restricted with what you can do with it, but some of it is open. So rather than send a learner to a video repository or database, and then within there they can look at the topical collection or series, and then within there look at individual videos, chances are the learner really just needs a chapter of that video, and in the spirit of images being the most frequently used open educational resource, probably just need a frame from that whole video. So the same qualities, though, regardless of granularity, apply, which are things that you know and use every day for your print resources: relevance, accuracy, quality, accessibility, interactivity, and licensing. So those kinds of that heuristic holds true. So once you are wrestling with the curatorial imperative, as I call it, you have to think about whether the resources are the right resource for the learning task. And this is really something that goes beyond what we do in collection development, but is nonetheless a really key part of curation, because it is about whether you have created the experience that the learner needs, or whether the learner was able to use the resources to create the evidence of competence that is required for the learning task. And so as David Wiley, who started us off, comes around at the end to say, is that really the main consideration after you think about all of the other standards that you apply to resources is how much are the students learning when they use the materials. So how do you measure this the effectiveness? And so that paradata, that feedback that we saw on the metadata paradata slide is really important. Have students write reviews. Have them contribute their star ratings to the digital library of resources in which you're helping them find learning resources that are open and able for them to use. Have them create an OER on a topic by pulling together various resources. That can be a very strong measure of how effective the smaller grains of OER you have are at creating a larger OER. And when you're assessing the learning, don't forget to ask about the resources. That's very important too. And make sure you're looking at your metrics, and I know you are, but also watch your activity streams. Where are people getting confused? Where are people going from one resource that you thought would be right for the activity onto another one? What are their frustration points? So a way that this might play out in the future, not now, because there are some barriers to this particular approach, is in an automated way. And that would be that the teacher goes into the classroom, sits down, logs in, the system knows who the teacher is, how long this teacher has been teaching, what sort of credentials and professional learning this person has, but also has a learner profile for every single learner in the classroom, what their grades are, whether they have an individualized education plan because they have a learning challenge of one sort or another, and how they've been faring in the class to date. And so also where the class should be in terms of content. And so with that packaged together, the system will be able to take from a vetted repository of open educational resources, probably built by the teacher librarians in the school, the appropriate resources for the learning task of the day that is differentiated in various ways for the different kinds of learners in the classroom. The teacher and the learners engage with the activities and the resources. There's some sort of formative assessment, probably a short quiz that they have to take. The results of the formative assessment determine who may need further work on the particular concept, and again, additional resources and vetted learning activities are pushed to the instructor. So that kind of system is coming. That kind of system would seem to exclude teacher librarians, except I can tell you in the areas that are particularly the state of Florida that are trying to implement this system, the thing that they are finding again and again is the key to the whole system is having a large enough repository of open educational resources, and they are finding that they can't accumulate those resources without their teacher librarians leading the effort. So one of the things that these systems are also able to do is follow a student's interaction with the particular learning activity, and it may be a group of students, figuring out where their frustration points. This is called an activity stream. What does the student do first? What does the student do second? What does the student do third? And watch all of this. And now in the age of student privacy issues, this is probably even a little bit longer down the road coming. However, I would argue that teacher librarians see activity streams every day. They're just in-person activity streams. So as you stand at your desk or at someplace in the library, you're observing what everybody's doing. You know who's working collaboratively, who's working independently, who's choosing to work on the smartboard, the kinds of resources they're selecting, whether they're physical, whether they're digital, and where their frustration points are. Like this young man over here on the side who is kind of staring out into space, but these kids here who are actively collaborating around the whiteboard. Pay attention to those streams and figure out what you can learn about the role of the resources and the learning processes there. So I think this is about the end of our time together, and I just wanted to have a big finish here. So just a few key points to have you take away. Our learners expect open. This is the open generation, and open educational resources, because of their licensing flexibility, really increases opportunities to learn. And personalize those experiences. And that open educational resources are more than video and text. They might be a digitized specimen. They might be a remote instrument. They might even be a person who's able to give good advice. And that curation, not collection development, creates experiences. There are far too many of these resources for us to aggregate. We've got to be thinking strategically about how to put together learning experiences and how to keep track of these resources so that we can combine and recombine them in various ways. This is an ongoing process, but digital libraries are a great place to begin. Make sure that you take advantage of that metadata that describes the educational application and that paradata that allows you to have your users, your learners, come back and rate the particular resource. Always keeping in mind that the resource size must be matched to the learning task. And think about how you're going to assess that OER effectiveness, especially when you look around your library and you see those activity streams in action. So this has been a lot of information in a long time. And one of the advantages of the flipped professional learning is you were able to pause me, rewind me, and you can come back and see me again. But if you want to know more, let's keep talking.